Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Charlotte campus of Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary. My name is Don Fairbairn. I'm the Academic Dean of the Charlotte campus, and it is a pleasure to have everybody here this evening. Those of you who are in person, it's good to see you, and we also have a number of people who are watching live on the live stream, and it's good to have them as well, even though we are not able to see them. This is the fourth of our major lectures that we have in a given academic year, which are collectively called the Klipowicz Integrative Events, that seek to integrate various things that students are learning with different aspects of Christian life and Christian ministry. And they are named, the series as a whole is named after our beloved former professor, now retired, Dr. Steve Klipowicz. Of those four events, two are sponsored by the Cooley Center for the Study of Early Christianity, and two of them, including this one, are sponsored by the Center for the Development of Redemptive Leadership. So at this time, I'm going to ask Dr. Rodney Cooper, the director of that center, to introduce our speaker for the evening.
Thank you, Dr. Fairbairn, and welcome. Glad you're here tonight. It's not too often you have the opportunity to introduce somebody that's had such a critical impact in your life for such good things. Harv has been a friend of mine for probably over 30 years now. You can't really imagine walking through a journey with too many people for that long. And yet, Harv's been there with me just about every step of the way. Harv is a graduate from George Fox University / Western Seminary. It's kind of a combined program. Has his PhD from there, and was also a graduate from Philadelphia College of the Bible. Harv also is a pastor of an inner city church, where he pastored in Philadelphia and pastored in a small church where African American and Hispanic and different groups came, and he shared in that context. Harv was the teaching fellow at George Fox University when I went there for my PhD. Harv supervised me, he ran group therapy, and we just hit it off as good friends. I think Harv wanted to follow and be with me just out of morbid curiosity to see what was going to happen to me down the road. So, Harv has been in various areas of leadership development. In fact, he's traveled around the country and around the world working with various leaders of major organizations and has done a lot of organizational change and development. He's also has done what you might say marital counseling and been an agent of change. I don't know anybody that's studied change more in the change process than Harvey has, and that's his area of specialty. He's been a therapist for over 30 years. He's been married 28 years. He has 3 wonderful daughters. His wife, Bev, is also a therapist and has her own private practice. And he's just now come out with a new book called Redemptive Leadership, which if you'd like to take a little peek at it and maybe pick up a copy, it'll be out here on the book table. Harvey comes not only with all the credentials and background, but he's the president of Redemir Group. Redemir is Latin for redemptive. And Harvey was the one who basically came up with what we call the redemptive leadership model. A lot of times you hear leaders and you hear what the descriptions are of what a leader should be. But when it comes to the redemptive leadership model, Harvey is the kind of an individual who says, this is how God shapes a person to get to be that kind of person. And so it's what we call a developmental model, taking a person through stages to become that. And now it's become pretty much his model that many people around the country and through our D-Men program have been utilizing in various areas. Harv and I have taught D-Men together for the last 12, 14 years. And I'd say the greatest thing that I can say to you is that he's my friend. I love this man. And I'm just glad he's here, and I was glad he's my buddy. Yeah. And now I got to suck it up and be a man again. And just let you know, Harv, that I'm glad you're here.
Me too, Ron.
And that's genuine emotion I feel.
Likewise.
I love you, man.
Love you.
And thank you for coming.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Hey, my friend. I would echo Rod's comments. It's rare to have good friends for over 3 decades and to share in each other's lives. There's a richness in that. Well, my privilege to be here with you tonight. I've been looking forward to our time together. And as Rod said, my organization is the Redemere Group, and we exist to work with faith-based leaders in business and also in church and parachurch to kind of unleash a transformational process in their life, looking for something that we call redemptive influence. That is how God uses us because of the various events of our lives, not in spite of them. And it's a different way of looking at it, which we believe goes to the heart of the gospel. Tonight, we're going to be talking about leadership and marriage. And I want to set a little bit of a framework to do that by offering some thoughts about how I see leadership at the Redemere Group with some core beliefs. The first thing I would say about leadership, and I think it's vital in whatever scope of leadership influence or footprint we have, is that organizational impact for leaders emanates from the influence of the senior leadership. Senior leaders and their teams become the DNA of the organizations in which they lead. And that's always sobering for me as a leader to realize that it is both my strengths and my shadow sides that always play out in my organizations. And I believe that's true for all of us in whatever our leadership footprint is. A second belief that is core to our model and framework about leadership is the heart of the leader and the senior leadership team set the tone for the organizational culture. So who we are as leaders and our senior team actually become the organizational culture. It's like we create a DNA that's transmitted throughout the organization, for better or for worse. That has many implications to it, one of which is this. The organizational culture, to define it, is the way that people actually experience the organization. So all of us have been in organizations where we have organizational beliefs or values posted somewhere in the organization. You know, oftentimes those are expressed in those statements, but they're not necessarily lived out in the organization, and there's a gap or a delta between what we say and how we actually live. What we're talking about is how the senior leadership team operates, and the leader actually becomes what people experience in the organization. And that's a sober stewardship for us in our footprint of leadership. That has the implication, then, that leaders must actively pursue an internal growth process in order to maximize their external impact. You see, who we are on the inside has a direct correlation with how we live our lives and how people come to know us. And we're all somewhere, like Rod said, in a developmental process, right? Some of us are kind of at beginning stages of our leadership influence, others in the middle stages, some in the mature stages. But throughout our lifespan, we have to be actively involved in an internal growth process to maximize our external impact. That actually, in some ways, is what this seminar is about, and others sponsored by the seminary, right? To call together people in various aspects of leadership influence to begin to reflect on where am I internally and how's that playing out externally. We believe that leaders must have a well-calibrated internal compass. You know, our internal development is directly related to our internal compass. And you know what an internal compass is? It's that interface between kind of our moral conscience and the Holy Spirit to guide us in the thousands of gray decisions that all of us face in leadership. And we all do all the time, right? And there's not a manual that you can look up the answer. Oftentimes we're making those decisions on the fly or engaged in a specific context. But it's critical that we continue to recalibrate our internal compass. Because if it gets off, you probably experienced it as I have, that's usually when we wind up justifying decisions or other kinds of actions that lead us in a very destructive way. And because leaders have a broader impact, we do, don't we? So that if I make a poor decision or if I experience some sort of failure, it has a larger impact because of my leadership influence. That's always true. So it's critical, we believe, that leaders do that internal development and continually recalibrate their internal compass. And lastly, and a lot of times you don't see this in leadership literature. In fact, a lot of times, sacred or secular, you kind of see the opposite. Healthy marriages, families, and relationships are essential to effective long-term leadership influence. You know, in the 30 years plus that I've had to work with leaders, there's a direct correlation between that. If people are in healthy marriages that are actively growing over time, it unleashes leadership influence. And if you've been in a marriage and leadership and you've been through a tough season, you know that how that affects you internally, and it also impacts you in your leadership influence. So marital health and relational health are directly linked to leadership impact, and we always have to keep that in front of us. So that sets a stage for our lecture tonight. So our lecture is about the umbrella of leadership, but we're going to zoom in tonight and look at healthy marriages and what that means and give you some frameworks that I think will be a little bit different for you. Now, most of these come from a framework that I've written down along with my Bev in a book. It's on Amazon, Marriage University or Marriage U, this workbook 101. So if this stimulates you some, know there's more material there for you to investigate, but I'm drawing for that. And the reason why Bev and I created something about healthy processes in marriage was if we can help marriages become more healthy, it directly impacts, as I've already stated, leadership impact. So Marriage U has a little bit of a broadly different framework around marriage than oftentimes we think of. The first thing that I would say is a foundation stone of what I'm going to share with you about marriage tonight is marriage must be understood from a health perspective. Let that sink in for a moment. Most of what you will read about in marital literature, again, sacred or secular, is talking about what can go wrong in marriage. Conflict, communication, money, sex, a variety of other things. But I would like to say, well, there's great value in that. Unless we have a framework of what health looks like, it's hard to go from what's wrong and head in a healthy direction if you have no idea what that looks like. And I believe, as we're going to examine tonight, the Word of God has a lot to say about healthy marriage. It gives us some vital principles, and there's a growing body of literature now from scientific research about that. So I want you to think tonight about what is a healthy relationship, what is a healthy marriage, and what is your framework around that? What do you believe about what health in marriage should and could and does look like? Second thing I would like to suggest that's a real critical issue is when we look at healthy marriages, including in the scripture, we have to have the framework that marriage is not an institution, but a living thing. You know, a lot of times we think about marriage as, you know, we go through a process and we get married, and as long as we don't do something big to muck it up, we're good to go. I don't believe marriage works that way at all. Just like our relationship with God doesn't work that way. So everyone here has had some sort of salvation experience, a place where you became spiritually alive. God, the Holy Spirit, worked in your life and regenerated you. But you know, as I do, that was just the very, very beginning of the journey, right? So spiritual development extends throughout our lifespan, does it not? It's not like we reach a place and we just plateau and kind of coast. God is always engaging us to transform us into the image of His Son, to know Him better. And you think about all the literature that's emerged and reemerged over the last 10 years about spiritual formation. So you see, our relationship with God is a living thing. And just like all living things or all living relationships, if we tend to it, think about your own experience, you become closer, right? more connected to God. You tune in more and have a greater sensitivity. And you, like me, at times I get busy and the centrifugal force of life pulls me apart and I'm not tending to my relationship with the Father, and I become less sensitive to Him. I have less awareness. You see, because our relationship with God is a living thing. It is a relationship, and it has to be tended to. Hear the framework shift about marriage? Marriage is relational by definition. It is not an institution. So we must tend to it. There are things we have to do to create what I like to call relational hydration. I live in Colorado. We're at high altitude. It's actually an alpine desert, and everyone there is tuned into hydration. You will see water bottles everywhere in Colorado because you can be hydrated in this moment, and by tomorrow afternoon, you may not be hydrated. And you have to learn the signs of dehydration. That's the, dry mouth, the chapped lips, a little bit of a dull headache, and a drop in energy is a sure sign you need to drink more. Relational hydration is kind of like that. And I'm going to give you some frameworks around that tonight. So if marriage is a living thing, like all relationships, and has to be tended to, what are the skill sets required to do that? So it has to be tended to, and marriage is a developmental process. Now, Rod laid a foundation about that. I know he does. I do. I see the world through a developmental lens. I see individuals in a developmental process. Think about newborns who become toddlers, who become tweeners, who become teenagers and 20 years old, 30 years old, 40 years old, 60 years old, 70. We are in a developmental process through our lifespan. Why is that? Creative design. God, in His infinite wisdom, has chosen to create developmental processes into all living things. So when you think about institutions, so you think about corporate gatherings like this at Gordon-Conwell. If you go back in the history of Gordon-Conwell, you will see a developmental process in the organization. It continues to develop. All living relational things do. But the same is true in marriage, which is a very different idea, isn't it? So what happens early in marriage is foundational, but we reach the stair step of transition and we go to a new stage. And one of the things about developmental processes is what worked at an earlier stage is typically not what we need at a new stage. More of the same doesn't help us accomplish whatever those developmental tasks are. So marriage is created by God in a developmental process like all living things, and that can be articulated. So those are some of the foundation stones when we think about marriage and a different framework, and that's how I'm approaching it. So I want to ask you this question and let it sink in a little bit. So when you think about, from our faith-based perspective, when you think about the purpose of marriage, of all things that God could have created around relationships, why did He choose marriage? And think health model now, what are some of the creative design purposes behind marriage? So what do you think about that? What would you say are some of the purposes that God intended around marriage? Shout it out loud. Procreation. It's not only the place for children to be born into, but it is the primary developmental crucible for kids, right? Growing into adulthoods. So if you think about your early development, it significantly shaped who you are today, right? About relationships, self-esteem, your spiritual formation, etc., etc. Those seminal events at different stages, not only do we create a new life, which is a miracle in and of itself, but marriage is the sort of environments, it is the culture in which human beings accomplish their primary developmental task. Very good. Other purposes in marriage? Companionship. So if you think a little bit about this whole notion of companionship, and we are going to look at the text in a moment, way back in the beginning charter of marriage in Genesis 2, there was something about companionship that was intended to be at the core of marriage, right? Of two human beings forming a certain kind of relationship, and we're going to use the term bond, that was essential, and God created marriage to address that. Any other purposes of marriage? Yes. Originally, they were to cultivate the garden together. So there's something about partnership in life, right? A little bit like companionship, but slightly different nuance. Somebody else? I couldn't hear you. Calling? Calling. In what sense do you mean calling? For God. So somehow, and I think this is essential, if we think about calling, but we'll broaden that a little bit, I think it includes calling, marriage is one of the places that is a primary crucible for spiritual formation. Now think about that. Any of you who've been married any length of time, does God work on you through your marriage?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, of course. And it's not in theory, right? It's in the practical day-to-day stuff of how do I deal with conflict? How do I deal with intimacy? What do I do with my emotions? How do I deal with differences? Have you noticed that? Your spouse is not you. Have you noticed that? Yeah, in all kinds of big, small, and in-between ways, right? And so in the spiritual formation sense, it becomes a transformational crucible. It's part of the mystery, I think, that Paul speaks of in Ephesians 5. There's something goes on at a deeper spiritual formation level. So when we think about the purposes of marriage, that helps define a little bit of our health model, doesn't it? It starts to create this framework or lens through which we can begin to see marriage. So we've mentioned this. Core purposes of marriage: companionship, intimacy, nurturing, procreation, and it is a primary developmental crucible. It is the place that surfaces our growth edges and gives us a real practical environment to grow. Now, we know the charter of marriage in Genesis 2 sets the foundation stone for our health model. So take a moment and read this verse. Then the Lord God said, "It's not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him." Take a moment and think about this. What strikes you about this verse? What are some of the key elements?
Capable on his own, that he needs another type of being to help him along, and vice versa.
And vice versa. Yeah, it's really an interesting idea, isn't it? To think of, original creation, that God created us with a need. Interesting to think about, isn't that? And actually, a need for another kind of being. And we're going to explore that a little bit more. It's interesting. So somehow, it's not good. We don't function well without another being in our lives. And there's plenty of research about this now. It's well documented that, in fact, not having loving, connected bonds in our lives is worse for your cardiac health than smoking a carton of cigarettes a day. Let that sink in. It actually represses immune system functioning. So we're much more receptive to a variety of diseases if we don't have close connected relationships in our lives. So there's something fundamental about creative design in that. And if we think about a health model of marriage, marriage is one of those places where we can experience that kind of relational connection. Anything else strike you about this verse? Yes.
Jesus said, there'll be one.
The Paraclete, right? It's kind of interesting, isn't it, to think a little bit about this concept of helper that's been applied in a variety of places. But here we see in the charter of marriage that very kind of language is used. And maybe, if we look a little bit deeper, it at least implies some of the spiritual formation aspects of what happens in marriage. Does God, through his Spirit, work through your spouse in your life? Kind of interesting to think about that. Both in calling you to growth, but also encouraging in you growth and supporting you, comforting you, etc., begins to form our model of marriage. So it's a real essential verse, and there's some key elements in this. We've already picked up on this notion of alone. It's not good for man to be alone or a human being to be alone. The Hebrew word here has to do with the notion, carries the gist of being isolated, about being disconnected, or being a one in its class. Now, what the irony here is in the Genesis text is the circumstances in which this was said. You remember what was going on in Genesis 2? This is a seminary, right? Okay, just checking. So what was going on in Genesis 2? Yeah, remember they were naming the animals? The creation had just come to its culmination. Man had been created, right? And Genesis 2, was it pre or post-fall? Pre-fall, wasn't it? And you remember what kind of relationship Adam had with God? How it was described? He walked with God in the cool of the day, right? You know, that's kind of an interesting text, especially to form the backdrop of this notion of marriage. So somehow Adam had a relationship with God, and it appears God manifested himself in some sort of corporal form to where they actually walked along and talked together. Pretty cool image, don't you think? In an ideal place, pre-fall, not marred by the fall, and this very intimate, close relationship with God. And God says it's not good for a man to be alone. What's the irony in that? He wasn't alone. God was with him. The Hebrew here actually sheds some light on that. It actually could be translated this way, that man needs another of the same kind. So you see, God created us, like we said earlier, with a need for other human beings in our life. And that serves as one of the foundation stones of a healthy view of marriage. That we need another human being and human beings walking in close connection with us in order to function well and be healthy according to creative design. That lays a foundation stone for the next piece of this, which is in Genesis 3, where this idea is expanded on, where it says, I will create a helpmeet for him in Genesis 2. Now, this word, helpmeet, is a really interesting word. We stumble over this like crazy in the English, right? And especially when we look at this in a cultural framework. So typically, most of us, if we think about a helpmeet or a helper, which is sometimes how this is translated, we kind of think about that in our culture as someone that's in a superior and an inferior position. It's kind of like being a plumber's helper. You know what the plumber's helper does? You know, they go out to the truck and get the wrenches and does whatever the plumber says, right? That is not the idea here at all. In fact, if you look into the roots of this word, it sheds some really interesting light. It's a compound word, azar negad. And azar carries the force of it that it's the idea of surrounding or protection. It's almost like this visual image of two people with their arms around each other, protecting each other from the world. Or in our common vernacular, it would be two people who have each other's back. Uniquely are a teammate together. Now, the second part of this compound sheds a different kind of light. The second part of the compound actually has this idea of being opposed or against. So think about that. The inherent in this idea of helpmate is this idea of together against. It's almost like two people with their arms around each other at the same time, with their hands against each other's chest, pushing away from each other. I believe it's the idea of counterbalance. It's the idea that another human being, and at the core of marriage, God intended there to be a fundamental tension at the core of marriage, of how do we come together while at the same time maintain our own individuality? By the way, any of you who have been married, do you ever experience tension at the core of your marriage? You know, it's kind of a relief, actually, to think about that. Sometimes in our mental model, we think a healthy marriage is one that has no tension. I believe, actually, God designed marriage to have a tension at its core. How do we form the connection and have each other's backs and be different people at the same time? Different in some fundamental ways, right? And everything from how you pack for a trip, to how you run your checkbook, to how you keep up with your car keys, to how you load the dishwasher, to how you set goals, how you study for exams. Have you noticed your spouse doesn't do it the way you do it? So what I would like to suggest in a healthy model of marriage, God created a tension to be at the core of marriage. How is it that we form that connection and maintain it? While navigating our individuality in the ways that we're different. Very different view. Counterbalance is at the heart of that. So think about this. This is a fun question to think about. What would it be like to be married to yourself? Amazing? Who said awful? Why did you say awful? And you would have 2 pieces of work, huh? It's kind of interesting. You know, whenever you work with marriages long enough, and I'm assuming you guys have and you experience it, it's amazing how your spouse tends to counterbalance. And you hear those stories over and over and over. My spouse likes to do it this way, I like to do it that way. And somehow in that tension creates a counterbalance. And every marriage has them in some place. So some people like to plan ahead. Usually the other person is crazy spontaneous, right? One person's a people person, life of the party, they never want to go home. The other person around 10 o'clock is saying, you know, we do have to work tomorrow. You know, one person runs the gas all the way to negative numbers on that little how many mileage is left. The other person pulls over and fills it up when it gets to halfway down. And everybody experiences that in some form. You see, unfortunately, what we really usually try to do in the early stages of marriage is we try to change our spouse. And who are we trying to change them into? Moi. God forbid that would happen. Imagine if there were 2 of you. So at the core level in marriage, God created this tension of how we come to terms with living with another human being. So I want you to think about this for a second. We've made some observations. God created us with a need for each other, a need for another human being or beings. He created us with differences, and marriage has been created to have a fundamental tension at its core. How do we move toward each other while remaining our own person and maintaining our individuality? And that is the master skill of marriage across its lifespan. Yes, Reginald.
Another key piece to that, finding a helpmate, is finding a suitable.
That's right.
So when you deal with this opposites, a suitable helpmate, you can work things out. The wrong mate, not so much so.
You know, I would say, yes, working those things out require a whole series of skills, don't they? Self-awareness, openness, willing to change and grow. And I think you're right, and I don't know about you, in my experience, oftentimes we come into marriage very, very unprepared with those skills, right? And it takes, you know, the iterations through marriage to even begin to learn how to do that, how to communicate effectively. But I would agree with you, Reginald. The idea there in the text is, I will create a helpmate suitable. But what that suitability is maybe something a little different than how we normally think of. So, you know, with the idea of counterbalance and tension at the core. So how do we navigate that? And then the second verse I want us to briefly look at in Genesis 2 is this familiar one. For this reason, a man shall leave his mother and father, be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Now, there's several key elements of this verse, but I want to shed some light on that in a little bit of a different way. This idea of leaving and joining is essential here. It's this idea of leaving behind entirely or completely. You know, if we would speak of that in our common vernacular, it would be really individuating, of becoming independent from our families of origin and beginning to wrestle with, to some degree, our own identity. This idea of joining, the Hebrew word, it's actually the Hebrew word for adhesive. Or in our common vernacular, it would be the bond of marriage, the core bond. So this leaving, joining has to do with individuating or separating and then creating a core bond. You know, at the heart of every marriage is a core bond. In fact, you know, from our traditions, we tend to emphasize the covenant of marriage, which I think is appropriate, but actually marriage and a covenant is only mentioned one time in the Old Testament, and that's in Malachi. It's not here in the charter of marriage. It's implicit, not explicit. But what is explicit is this joining or the core bond. How do we bond at a heart level with another person? And how do we maintain that heart bond? Now, I don't know if you've seen this diagram before. This is one that you will commonly see in marriage. This idea of a Venn diagram of two interlocking circles. Seen that, right? This is what marriage looks like. I personally think this is the wrong idea. In family therapy research and literature, this is a diagram of enmeshment, where two people merge and both lose something essential about themselves. This is also what you will see in our common society in love songs, right? You know, the famous quote from Jerry Maguire, which is, "You complete me." It's the idea that I don't have enough in me to function independently. And I would say, actually, that's a part of the leaving process, is progressively over time, we form more of our own sense of self and identity. But what I would say is this might be a better diagram where there are two people who come together and then form a boundary around them, which is the covenant of marriage, that uniquely sets the relationship off or as distinct. Certain things belong in the relationship, certain things belong outside of the relationship. And that's the notion of the covenant. But what I would like to suggest is that the core is the bond, the heart bond. We all know marriages who have the covenant intact and the heart bond died decades ago. Do you know what I'm talking about? Two people who live as roommates but really don't function very much as a couple at all. So when we think about healthy marriage, we need, I believe, an intact covenant and an alive and vital core bond. Now that begs the question, what is a core bond? How do you begin to kind of create that and keep it healthy? And after we take a break in a moment or two, the second half of our talk tonight is going to be about that specifically and a couple of tools about that. So I want you to think about this with me for a moment. These are two great discussion questions. What is one way that your spouse counterbalances you? And just a little bit of guidance, it's probably going to be in a way in which they annoy you. A way in which they're different from you, that they are not you, and you have to navigate around that on a regular basis. And beginning to see that through a different framework, that somehow God is forming something in you through those differences. Interesting, isn't it? Secondly, how does this create this tension, both stability and tension, the way in which they're different from you? So I would like to leave you with that question, not asking you to discuss it right now. But it's a great tool to actually begin to talk about with whoever's closest to you, and especially your spouse. What's a way that they see you as different from them, and how does that way create both tension and stability together? So I'll give you an example from my own life. Bev and I have been married for a long time. I have 3 daughters and a wife, all women in my house except for me. And I am the only introvert in the entire household. That is true. There are more words spoken in my household in a day than you can even count. And as an introvert, my style of approaching things is not to elbow my way into a conversation. In fact, I can be completely quiet and fully engaged in a conversation. And what it typically does in my household, including with my kids, all of my kids will come to my wife and say, "Is Dad upset?" And I'm not upset, I'm just different than the other people in the household. So that creates a tension in our household. It does. So there's always this dynamic of when I reach my fill of extroverting, I need, like at Christmas, some time by myself. But that is so foreign to Bev. Bev is a massive extrovert. She likes to talk to everybody, everywhere, and is really artful at it. She's a very interesting person and a great conversationalist. So that has created tension for us until we began to use the language around sometimes I need time alone, and she really likes to fill her life with one more thing with people. And how do I support her in that? Because it's a very rich thing and not shame her somehow for it, but yet find a way to still spend time by myself. I'll give you a little snapshot. We were on vacation in Mexico, had a week away at one of those beach resorts, and a friend of ours was 2 resorts down by himself. He was a single guy and he was spending the week there by himself. And so we're there by the pool, and Bev is reading her magazine, I'm reading my book, and she says, "Would you ever want to spend a week by yourself at a beach resort?" So you can imagine what was going on in my mind a little bit. Do I look good in this, right? So I said, "Well, actually, yeah." And she put her magazine down and she goes, "What would you do?" Well, I'd take long walks on the beach. I would write in my journal, might write some poetry. I'd read a bunch of books, bring my camera. And then I said, "Would you ever want to spend time by yourself?" And she goes, "For maybe a day and a half." And then I would hate it because I would want someone there to enjoy it with me. You hear the differences in that? It's not a right or a wrong thing, but there are real differences in that. So earlier stages of our marriage, I might have tried to get Bev to be more like me and wound up shaming her for that. Or she might do the same reciprocally, but finding a way to talk about our differences and still stay connected. So I want to leave you with those 2 questions. It'd be great to talk over with your spouse in an open, non-defensive way and think a little bit about what those differences are and how they create counterbalance, but also where they create tension. So I'm gonna give us a break. If you would, take about 10 minutes or so, come back, and we're going to talk about how to feed the core bond. So if we could begin to think a little bit about the process we've been in tonight. We've been talking about developing a framework of what health looks like in a marriage. And some of those key essential elements is that at the heart of healthy marriages, we have to think about this core bond. That's what's at the heart of not being alone. And it's also about the joining aspect that is talked about in that charter plank that we looked at in marriage. The second big idea in that that we've talked about is God created marriage, I believe, with a core tension in it. How do we love and connect with someone who's not us? And we have to learn how to do that in various developmental stages over time. And how we navigate that, our differences, has a direct impact on our core bond. So a lot of times, if we try, and almost everyone does, tries to change their spouse somehow, that usually does some damage to the core bond over time, right? And other kinds of things tend to strengthen the core bond. So as you begin to develop your framework about marriage, both in your own marriage, but in the marriages you have a chance to touch somehow and guide, I want to think a little bit now in the second part of our lecture tonight about this core bond and what some of the dynamics of it are, and one way, one model, my model, of thinking about how we strengthen the core bond. So remember, we talked about the core bond is something that's living. Another way to say that is our core bond is not static. So it's not like we get bonded and we just stay bonded. In fact, life, even the good things in life, are like centrifugal force that pull the bond apart. So the classic example in marriage is you have this minor life event happen called having kids. And, it's a wonderful thing. It's a bonding experience. There's nothing quite like going through the pregnancy, seeing this new life born, and it does bond you to your spouse, but it also consumes all of your disposable time, income, and energy, right? So it also begins to pull you apart. And then if you have 2 kids or 3 kids and so on, you get the idea. Sometimes something great that bonds us is a ministry calling, right? So we both feel called to a particular ministry, we get into it, and this wonderful/terrible thing happens. It begins to grow. And then you find yourself working like crazy, exhausted and tired. You see, it pulls us together and then pulls us apart. Life is like centrifugal force on the bond. And that is normal. That is not pathology. This life or this bond is dynamic, just like our relationship with God is, right? Our relationship with God is a living thing, and it's dynamic. It's not that we get close to Him and just stay that way. We are constantly in this movement together and apart by all of the events of our lives. So that's a very different mindset in thinking about this core bond. And a lot of times, we talk about this bond by using the I word, intimacy, right? It's the thing that all of us know that's important, but it's totally hard to define. And I'm going to try to put some definition to that. So I'm going to ask you for some help on that one. How would you define intimacy? What is intimacy?
Trust.
Complete trust. What do you say that?
They will care for the deepest part of your soul in a trustworthy manner.
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of qualitative in your answer, right? This idea or context of trust, but also this idea of care, but care at a deeper level. We could add other words, safe to that, right? Trust, safety, good. Anyone else? How would you define intimacy? Love, and expand a little bit. What do you mean? Yes. At a very deep level. Love at a deep level. Love that our sister talked about as caring. And I really like that you wove the notion of the art of forgiveness is woven through that, right? We are all mere mortals, are we not? And on our best day, we're mere mortals. On our worst day, we're mere mortals. So this idea or the art or dynamic of forgiveness has to be woven through our core intimacy or our bond. Anyone else? What would you add to this? Yes, please.
Vulnerability. You can be vulnerable. You can express your truest, most intimate self with this other person.
Very good. We can express our truest, most intimate self, and we would call that vulnerability. So a lot of times we take off our armor or the mask that we sometimes wear for the rest of the world, or those protective layers, and that allows us to be known at a different place. So we've begun to map around some of the key ingredients that have to do with intimacy. Some would define intimacy, you probably heard it said this way. Our English word intimacy comes from the Latin word intima, which means inner or interior or innermost. Almost like if you could think about our lives, your life, being like a series of concentric circles, kind of like a bullseye. Intimacy is about progressively allowing someone in to those more innermost circles. That's kind of what we're talking about with vulnerability or progressively being known. And it also involves the reciprocal, doesn't it? So in a relationship, intimacy means not only are we known, but we progressively know someone else. It's the idea of knowing the inside or the essential nature of a person. The deeper part of a person has to do with intimacy. And we've already talked about this. This is core to this idea that we just looked at in the creative design of marriage. This idea of the core bond is synonymous with this process of intimacy or knowing or that deeper love or that connection or caring, the place where we're known at the deepest level. You know, it's interesting, over probably the last 10 years, plus or minus, there's been a growing body of research on this idea of being known and its impact on our lives. We mentioned a little bit earlier about being connected, however that is, in positive ways, is good for our immune system. We know that actually, when we're deeply connected, we have more energy. It's a great cure for depression. It begins to affect us in a very, very positive way, and then the absence of that, or the decline of that, actually affects us in some very, very negative ways. What we know about this deeper bond is it's what brings marriage in particular alive. It actually generates energy. In fact, when we feel deeply connected, we could put you in a CAT scan and now measure changes in your brain. So one of the things that happens when you feel deeply connected, your brain is calmer. In fact, your brain begins to emit certain hormones. One of them is oxytocin. It's called the cuddle hormone. It gives you that warm sense of well-being when you're connected. It's calming. It's centering. We know that the electrical activity and blood flow in your brain goes to your prefrontal executive function. You begin to operate more in your mature brain when you're connected. When you're less connected, most of us start to operate more toward our lizard brain, our immature brain, and our prefrontal cortex starts to go darker. So this connection thing is integrally woven into creative design. Remember how we talked about developing a framework for healthy marriage? You see, God created us to really need the kind of connection that we're talking about. So it has to do with the innermost. It has to do with being known in this safe, vulnerable, connected way. Now, it's interesting. We'll just look at a couple of pieces of research. Ted Hudson from the University of Texas studied this and showed that emotional responsiveness on the part of partners is the best 5-year predictor of marital or relational health. That is, when your partner calls for you, that you orient toward them and respond in a positive emotional way. So when your partner says, I feel afraid, or I feel hurt, or I'm discouraged, or I need encouragement, that your spouse is able to orient toward that and move toward you, and you're able to move toward them. And what tunes us into our spouse or creates attunement is this core connection. When we feel close, we begin to read our spouse and sense those shifts, and we begin to move toward them. When we get disconnected, it's almost like our receivers become less sensitive. We become distracted by a bunch of other things, and our core bond begins to drift apart. And that alters the core culture or state of a marriage when we become less responsive. Hudson also found that understanding emotional responsiveness and connection is essential to maintaining marital health. Translating that, what he's saying is learning the skills and having a model to begin to think about being sensitive to the core connection is essential to maintaining marital health over the long term. I would say it, that maintaining a strong core bond, even though we get pulled apart, learning the skills to rebond again and again and again is what maintains marital health over the long haul. Now, the question becomes, what does that look like specifically? And I want to offer you some thoughts about what that looks like. So easing into this discussion, I want to put this question on the table. What factors block this kind of deepening bond or intimacy with a spouse? What kind of things get in the way of that?
Distrust, deceit.
Mistrust, deceit can do that. If there's a fracture in that core level of honesty between us, right? What else?
Infidelity.
Infidelity can do that, right? Where there's a breach in the core bond and also in the covenant. And that can look a lot of different ways, can it? It can look like literal infidelity, where someone becomes involved sexually with someone else. It can also be if there's emotional infidelity, where someone in the relationship becomes bonded at that core level with someone else. It rocks the core of the relationship. Other things? Unhealthy communication, in what sense do you mean?
Whatever comes out your mouth depends on what you say, how you say it, the tone. Nonverbal is just as bad.
Yes.
Pulling away.
Distancing, disconnection, stonewalling, communication. How we communicate toward our spouse. And do we communicate in an honest but respectful way? Or do we become condescending or damaging or taking cheap shots? That damages the core bond, doesn't it? How we deal with conflict directly impacts the core bond, doesn't it? And most of us come into marriage with limited conflict resolution skills. We learn those primarily from our families of origin. And if you're anything like me, I learned very little positive about that from the home I grew up in. So we go in with a deficit in skills sometimes. Defensiveness, right, can also damage the core bond or block that, right? Texting and electronics can damage the core bond. I know you all know that at some fundamental level. There's a growing body of research on this now. And, if you go to any major event, I don't see anyone texting here, but any major event, and especially if the lights are turned low and you look down the row, what do you see? Almost everyone is on their phone. So that blocks direct connection. Not that it's all bad, but whenever it takes me out of being with you in this moment, it begins to block that core connection. So there are many, many things, even good things in life, that can take us away or deplete our energy or distract us from paying attention to the core bond. So I want us to turn our attention to developing maybe a mindset, a little bit of a model, and then I'm going to point you at some skills that are takeaways. I think if we could think about how we reinforce the core bond, there are 5 major channels through which we strengthen our core bond. I like to think about these channels as kind of like strands of a rope. You know how a rope is made up. Individual strands are woven together to get the whole of the rope. I think these are like strands of a rope. The whole is intimacy or the core bond. These are some subsets on what really strengthens or how we feed or hydrate our core bond. Now, a couple things about this model, if you could think about it. This model, each of these areas is a continuum. So at any given time, we can be connected 0 to 100%. And I believe these are always in flux. Remember, dynamic, not static. It's kind of like looking at the sound bar graph on an old school stereo. You know how the sound waves would go up and down in a bar graph? This is sort of how our relationship works. There's a fluctuation around these areas. It's multifaceted, like strands that make up a rope. And it also forms a gestalt. Remember what a gestalt is? German word that means the whole is more than the sum of the parts. Meaning when you combine these, they become something of a higher order. They strengthen the bond at a deeper place when we're closer on all of them. Each is a continuum. Each is dynamic. Now this is really important. Sometimes we think about our capacity for intimacy or connection with God or with someone else as being sort of fixed. Meaning, if you could, think about a pie graph, a chart, pie chart, it's like we have a certain amount of capacity for connection. And the question is, do we just max that out and to what degree. I actually think in all of these areas, our capacity to connect actually expands as we try to grow in those areas. Think about your relationship with God. Way back when you were early as a believer, you defined closeness with him in a certain kind of way. As you've traveled in your faith development process, I would predict your capacity is actually expanded. So pick an element like trusting God. Way back when, early on, you trusted God in a very meaningful way. But what that means to you today has probably expanded than the first few steps in your life as a believer, right? So I think this is true also with our spouse, that over the lifespan of marriage, our capacity as we work in these areas actually can expand, deepen, grow. So the first area that I want us to look at is the dimension of emotional connection. And there's a lot we could say about emotional intimacy or emotional bonding. Essentially, it involves a progressive heart connection. There's a growing body of research about this, of learning to engage our hearts and have a language where we can talk about what's going on at a heart level actually creates more bonding. So this has some subsets to it. It's a progressive revealing of ourselves to our partner. And then our partner is responsive to that. So remember how we talked about emotional responsiveness earlier? So if your partner begins to open up and share something that is important to them at a heart level, that we orient to that and attune to that and begin to draw them out, that feeds the heart bond. And when that happens in reverse, same thing happens. Now, there's some prerequisites to this. The first thing to be able to share at a heart level is you have to develop a heart language. So a lot of times for us, when we talk about an emotional language, we may have the basics. It's kind of like knowing the primary colors of emotion. I'm happy, sad, afraid, mad, and you got it all now. That's all there is. But actually, like any other field, we can begin to expand our knowledge. So all of you have been in seminary for a while, and you have a very developed theological language, biblical language now, right? So if we were to talk about substitutionary atonement, most of you would know what that means and why it's important, etc. So the same thing is true with a heart language. So when we begin to develop a heart language and emotional vocabulary, that allows me to share with you more about what's inside me. So instead of just having red, blue, and green, I now can talk about salmon or cyan or magenta, or you get the idea. So how do you learn a heart language? A good starting place is to look up an emotional word list and begin to kind of develop your vocabulary. Just like when you started either the counseling program here or one of your biblical classes, you had a vocabulary list, and I bet you at first there was a lot of foreign material there. Works the same way with a heart language. The more I have a language, the more I can let you know me. The second thing that's essential in this is self-reflection, which leads to self-awareness. Let that sink in a little bit. If you ask me, Harv, what's inside you? Tell me about your heart. I don't only have to have a language to do that, but I have to have some level of self-awareness, right? So I have to reflect enough inside to say, what is inside me? So as I'm able to begin to articulate that, then I can share it with you. And those of you who have studied spiritual formation, sharing at the spiritual level, works the same way, doesn't it? You have to reflect to develop self-awareness spiritually in whatever way you do that. It can be journaling, can be taking some quiet time looking inside. It can be beginning to come up with what is inside and play with the words or the metaphors, because that is foundational to let someone else know you. And it takes some discipline. It usually feels really awkward at first, but it expands my ability to connect at that emotional level. The next area I want to look at, we don't normally think of with bonding, is the intellectual area. God has created us not only as emotional beings, as heart beings, but also as head beings. Intellectual intimacy involves the sharing of our thoughts, our opinions. About what? About our faith, history, current events, work, what we've been reading, about a crazy lecture that we attended on a Tuesday night at the alumni thing. It's some idea, something that's captured our imagination, something that we're learning, something that we've read, something that's stimulating to us, and we begin to share it with another person. Intellectual intimacy sometimes means finding learning activities that we can share together, taking classes, reading, pursuing new experiences. What the idea is here is that we have to continue, remember our thesis of actively growing internally to mean healthy as a leader. Same way here. We have to stay stimulated intellectually. If we plateau, and all of us have at times, whenever your thought life kind of plateaus, you know what that feels like. It feels kind of dull, less sensitive. But you get a new idea or something that inspires you, it has an energy to it. That's what we're talking about, and learning to share that as a couple. I think humor is a part of intellectual closeness. It's that playful humor where we use play on words or past experiences. Now, this is the kind of humor that draws us together, not the kind of humor that has barbed wire hidden in it someplace. So that kind of humor does damage and pulls us apart. Everyone laughs while someone bleeds. But we can also be playful with our humor and even poke fun of it ourselves or be lighthearted about that. That draws us closer together. What are some of the skills? Developing a learning posture. I would encourage you to think about that. Obviously, all of you are alumni. You put a lot of time and energy onto becoming alumni in whatever program you were in. What I would say is keep learning in whatever field stimulates you, because that's directly linked to connecting with your spouse and other people. Developing the art of conversation. I think at an intellectual level, this is a really critical thing on how you begin to draw someone into a conversation. Asking them, what do you think about fill in the blank? And there's 1,000 topics to begin to have a conversation along that line. What do you think about gridlock in Congress? What do you think about the major events that have happened in the Methodist Church lately? What do you think about what's going on in Venezuela? You get the idea. So there's 1,000 things that we can draw each other into a conversation. What did you do today? How did you see God in your life today? Tell me a little bit about what has happened this week that's most important to you. Those kinds of conversations draw us into each other, the art of conversation. Another aspect of this is cultivating an openness to new things. You know, life is full of rich things to learn about. And if we can kind of open up a little bit and be willing to experiment, that creates that energy I'm talking about. And as a couple, one of my favorite assignments is to ask a couple to alternate in choosing something that they're going to learn about. So first, flip a coin. Whoever goes first says, I've always wanted to learn about, flamingo dancing. And the other person says, that scares me to death, but I'm going to give it a try. I'm going to learn about that. Or classical music, or painting, or you got the idea. Being open to learn, and then the other person next time picks a learning activity. It creates bonding. It connects us. Next area that I want to look at is the idea of physical intimacy. And I'm talking here not about sexual intimacy. I'm talking about how we touch each other and share space. This involves sharing the space around us. So if you're married, I want you to think a little bit about, do you have space in your home that's a comfortable place for you and your spouse to have conversation and hang out? So Bev, my wife, and I, on the weekends, we don't have schedules, and in our bedroom, we have these 2 chairs around this little table where we will wake up early and have coffee. And that's a time that we connect for our week. And I love that space. It's kind of intimate, really comfortable. There's a window there. We can see outside. And it's got these swivel chairs, so it's not like you have to stare directly at the other person. You can be at an angle. And we both love that space. Do you have a space for your partner where you guys talk and connect that feels comfortable to both of you? And what we know, and research shows us, a lot of times if we have these rituals of connection, which include space, it has a way of drawing us closer. That's a way to feed connection at the physical level. It also involves touching, hugging, holding hands, snuggling, kissing, sitting close on the couch. What we know is when we're in physical contact with each other, it releases that cuddle hormone, oxytocin. It actually calms us. So I don't know if you've ever tried this. If your spouse is upset, touch them. It has a calming effect. So we're talking about things like not doing the drive-by hug. In fact, one of the things you can try coming out of our seminar tonight, just try this, is hug your spouse long enough, looking them in the eyes until they start to feel uncomfortable. So have them squirm a little bit. It's that idea that sometimes we get used to just glancing past each other because of our busy lives, but slowing that down to make real contact. Sometimes with couples, I will have them try this, to sit down and have a conversation without using any words, just by touching each other's face. And it feels really weird at first, but it actually changes how you see your spouse, how you engage your spouse, and begin to think a little bit about how you express yourself in a different way. So physical intimacy involves all of that because touch releases chemicals that calm us, de-stress us, and bond us to the other person. Please, Reginald.
Why would you say touching, kissing, snuggling, but say not sexual, versus saying not only sexual?
Yeah, in this, yes, but we're focusing on the non-sexual aspects of touch. I'm going to talk about sexual in a moment. I think that's vitally important as well. So some of the skills, thank you for asking that question, on touching, the first big one is slowing down. How fast is the speed of your life, right? So a lot of times we have to slow down to be able to make contact. Like that big ritual when we've been apart and we come back together, we usually hug and we'll give each other a kiss. Slowing that down enough to make real contact, or getting up in the morning and having 10 zillion things to do, of carving out a little bit of time to slow down to make contact. I find this idea of slowing down in our world is critical on a number of these dimensions. The other thing is staying in the moment and being fully present, like making eye contact, or like, spending some time just really looking at your spouse and engaging them. We have to slow down internally as well as externally. Another area of connection is the spiritual area. I don't know if you've thought about this and where you are. We tend to change our spiritual practices over our developmental period as believers. And remember, developmental processes is the things that really helped us at one stage. We may need to develop something slightly different at a different stage. Not that what happened earlier was bad, but we need something slightly different at a new stage. So that's true spiritually as well. So in the early developmental years of my life, I was discipled by a navigator. And any guess what he taught me to do? Memorize scripture. I still have all of these index cards of the topical memory system. And that was very, very meaningful and rich at that phase of my life. But if I only do topical memory systems, I would never have learned about Lectio Divina or centering prayer or how to do a silent retreat. You get the idea that we need to continue to develop all kinds of skills along this line over our lifespan. I would like to suggest that we need to do the same thing in our marriage. So we need to develop practices around prayer, worship, serving, engaging God's word, sharing and doing a mission or serving in some way together. But the idea here is I would like to encourage you to think about doing it in a little bit of a fresh way. So if you've been really good about developing one of those practices, at some level, we need to shift and try something a little bit different. Anything that we do 9,000 times the same way tends to go flat. There's something about the imago Dei in us that needs something fresh or different for it to stay alive. And I would encourage you to think about that with your spouse. The idea here is intentionally developing our faith together and beginning to articulate a language of spiritual development. So, do you have a language of spiritual formation with your spouse? What's the last book you read together? Have you read Janet Hagberg's book, The Critical Journey, Stages on the Life of Faith, etc.? The idea is there's a lot out there, but sometimes in the intellectual area, we could begin to read a book and develop a language to practice something a little bit different in our spiritual connection. And then learning the art of spiritual conversation. You know, that idea of slowing down and asking our spouse, how did you encounter God this week? My youngest daughter is 22. She's a senior at CSU. And one of the practices I started with her when she went off is I text her every morning. And in phases of that, I've asked her, let's, for tomorrow in our texting, tell me how you have seen God's presence in your life today. And so the next morning, I'll share something like that with her. She'll share something like that with me. It's the idea of beginning to start a spiritual conversation. One couple I worked with came up with this idea. It was a great idea. They were going to go downtown Denver for dinner, and their dinner was at 6. They went down at 4, and they both split up, and they walked individually through the city, and they used their iPhones, and they had the assignment to take a picture of how they saw God's face in the city. And then when they got together for dinner that night, they scrolled through their picture and began to say, this is how I saw God, or this is what struck me about my relationship with God, or this is how I saw an expression of God's face in the city. You hear that? A little bit different, but it starts a conversation at a deeper level. So there's 1,000 ways to do that, but beginning to develop with some intentionality the art of spiritual conversation. The last area that I want to talk about is about sexual intimacy. And sexual intimacy has a unique element through creative design that bonds us at a deeper level. Many places in Scripture talk about this. It's not just a physical act. It involves something at a deeper level inside of us. But I would like you to think about sexual intimacy on a continuum. So what I mean by that, instead of viewing it just as the expression of making love, having sex with a spouse, I would like you to think about it in a broader way at first of how we express our sexuality. So there's maleness and femaleness. How do you and your spouse express that and appreciate the differences in gender? From how you dress, to how you think, to how you see the world, to how you carry yourself, to what's important. Those are ways that we begin to express our sexuality. So it's a broader way of seeing sexual expression as a gateway or a means, even of developing some of the other strands. Viewing sexual intimacy, too, as a capacity that can be increased. So I think, at the upper levels, it's about expressing our gender in that sense of sexuality. And then in the middle ranges, it's learning the art or relearning the art of sort of flirting with our spouse. Learning to let them know that they're attractive to us, that we like them, that we desire them. And often after we've been married for a while, that muscle atrophies and beginning to renew it a little bit more. You look really nice in that color. Or, whenever you look at me that way, it still gives me chills at a deeper place. Those are ways that we flirt or express that they matter to us, that they occupy a unique place in our lives. What are some of the major skills? A lot of times for couples, it's kind of counterintuitive in a way. You would think, especially when we've been together for a long time, people would be more comfortable in talking at this level, but generally speaking, we aren't. So a key skill is breaking the ice and gaining comfort about talking about sex. You know, if you want to get your spouse's attention, probably saying, I'd like to learn about talking about sexuality in the broad way, probably will get their attention. And beginning to figure out, how do we do that? How do we expand our sexual vocabulary? How do we begin? Well, you can read. It'd be interesting to do, wouldn't it? Ask you and your spouse, you pick a book on sexuality, I'll pick one, and we'll alternate in reading each other's books and using it as a part of developing the art of conversation around sexuality. Another thing is to adopt a learning posture about sex. First and foremost, like we've talked about in each of these areas, you have to develop some self-awareness first. So what do you know about your own sexuality at this season of your life? So what does it mean to be masculine or feminine? And how do you express that? Also, how do you know when you're in touch with being attracted to your spouse? What does that look like, feel like? Where is it inside? And I know sometimes we get so busy in life, that sexual part of us kind of gets turned down. And what we're talking about, like in the spiritual area, is becoming aware of that, powering it up again. And then cultivating a sexual attitude. And what I mean by that is a lot of times, you know, that centrifugal force of life that pulls us apart will begin to shut down even our mindset around sexuality. I hear it from couples all the time that a lot of times they don't have time or energy, or their sexual life kind of eventually sort of reaches a place where they begin to try to engage sexually when they have quality time at 11:30 p.m. at night. When they're exhausted, they don't have energy, they're worried about getting up the next day, they have a list going through their head, you get the idea. That occupies our mindset around our sexuality versus seeing it as one of the essential elements of feeding our bond. Generally speaking, my experience as a psychologist over 30 plus years, we don't do a very good job with this as believers. We kind of talk about sex, but probably not explicitly enough. So I would encourage you in your leadership footprint to begin to learn more about that, on how you help couples have that conversation in a healthy way. Because there's lots of unhealthy conversations around sexuality out there, right? It's interesting, you guys probably know this. The current research says the number one way that men and women under 25 get their sex education is how? Yeah, through pornography, which is a great way to get sex education, isn't it? Especially when we're thinking about creative design in a holistic view. So creating the conversation and mindset around sexuality in a very direct way is so essential. And a lot of the people that are in your sphere of leadership influence, they need someone to be able to broach that. But we have to have it first. So in summary, I want you to think about these for a sec. Conventional wisdom says intimacy must proceed in a particular order. You know, those 5, you start with emotional intimacy, boom, 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 and you reach sexual intimacy. That's broadly our conventional wisdom around sexuality. I would like to suggest, in reality, the strands are more like the strings of a guitar. They can be played in a different order at different times. Now, there is some truth in that linear order. We need to, I think, establish an emotional connection and so on, and it gives its fullest fruit expression in the sexual way. But once we're core bonded and we have a healthy bond in place, I think we play them in different orders at different times. So sometimes we may make an intellectual connection that actually leads us to feeling emotionally close, which may lead us to a sexual expression, and then we result in being thankful for our relationship. Or it can come in a different order, like the strings of a guitar. Each of us has natural strings or channels of intimacy that are more developed. So if you look at those 5, probably 1 or 2 of those are your more natural channels. Those muscles are exercised more. What I would say, creative design, we have the capacity in all of them. So how do you develop those other channels? I've given you some ideas about that. Deeper bonding requires that we develop all of us, or develop the underdeveloped parts of who we are. So I would like you to think about these 5 channels for a minute, kind of like a roadmap or a dashboard. It's a way to kind of check, and it's kind of interesting to do with your spouse. Where are we in these 5 areas, 0 to 100%? And, rate it yourself in a quick and dirty way, and then ask your spouse to rate. Where do you think we are? It's kind of a check-in to see how connected are we in these areas, and what are the growth areas. So if you would, at the end of your handout is a worksheet that looks like this on the 5 channels of intimacy. And you will see that it's a way to guide you, it's kind of a takeaway, and your partner to begin to do an assessment. Reflect on what your natural channel of intimacy is that you reflexively use. What are your top 2? That's kind of an interesting discussion. Ask your spouse to do the same. Identify your spouse's top 2. What do you think theirs are without talking to them? Discuss with your partner what the answers to 1 and 2 are. What insights do you glean? And what's one channel that your partner might like you to strengthen? Could be a very productive way to apply these 5 channels. I want to stop, create a little bit of space, and ask you this question. So if you think tonight about your life and a takeaway, or maybe it's in your area of ministry, what's 1 or 2 things that stood out the most from our talk tonight for you? Please. Yes. The comment was that sometimes we don't deal with that really well within the context of the church. And what are some of the better books out there? What I would say is there's a real need for some comprehensive approaches to sex, and especially from a faith-based perspective. I don't have 1 or 2 that I would point to that I give clients to read. I think there's a great need. There's a bunch of books out there. One that's better than others is a book called Between the Sheets. Another one's called Passionate Marriage. It's not by a faith-based perspective, but I think there's a real need for work in this area. And a curriculum for people, not only talking about sex itself, but sexuality itself. What does maleness, femaleness mean? How we express it. Other things that struck you? Takeaways? Yes, please.
The tensions within marriage that God originally intended. I've always viewed some of these intentions as something negative.
Yes.
And then after you shared that, Dr. Booth came up and said how sin removed that tension. Of course, now the woman.
Yeah.
As this kind of this.
It's a whole different way of thinking about it. That there's supposed to be tension there, right? It's also kind of a relief, isn't it? For all of us who are married. Yes, please.
I'm amazed because I think that it's a different perspective that I even for her question that this is not something that is normally taught.
Yes.
Like you said, there's a need for this.
Yeah, different mindset, different framework, right? About that. Yeah, frameworks are critical in all areas, and a lot of times we always have frameworks. Sometimes we don't even know what they are, but shifting them to a broader perspective creates all kinds of possibility. I would agree with that. How about a couple of others? What are you going to take away tonight? What stood out you want to think about? Please.
How can a single develop intimacy?
I think that's where we need communities. So with close friends, if you're single, that's a place to practice the art of bonding. Sometimes we can do that to a degree with our families of origin, depending on where it is, but particularly with good, close friends in a community that we're seeing on a regular basis. That's a good way to do that. And I also think in our communities, making sure that there are cross-gender relationships. By that I mean, a lot of times, and you know how this works, we tend to kind of get together with our own gender to theorize about what the other gender is like. So having a bunch of guys talk about how women work or vice versa, not a good idea. So we need safe, good, mature, cross-gender conversations, even about sexuality, in my opinion. Yes?
I often use the term intimacy with the Almighty.
Yes.
And how would you define that in light of the five-strand cord?
You know, I think we bond with God in many of those dimensions as well. I really do. So we could think about each of those dimensions, what that looks like in the expression of our spiritual formation. Yes? Yes. Right.
From that, but if you look at it from a capacity standpoint and a more fluid expansion standpoint, then
yeah, that idea that we have capacity actually expanding. That's a great idea, and I don't know, personally, I think there's a glimpse into eternity probably in that for me. That even on the other side of heaven, whatever that means, I think we will continue to grow and expand in our knowledge and experience of each other and God, I really do. But that we're not limited, that we're growing and have the potential for expansion is a rich idea, I would agree with you. Yes, please.
I think this was terrific, but I'm wondering if a lot of couples would need to have sort of be coached in this over a weekend or
yes.
longer, because this is hard for a lot of couples to do on their own. There's a lot of issues that will come up.
Yes.
They've become roadblocks. So marriage encounter that the Catholic Church has started years ago is a wonderful format.
It is. It is a wonderful format.
I don't know what the counterpart is for the Protestant counterpart, but what can you suggest that couples could go through something like this in an account, like in a marriage?
I really like what you're saying, is that we all, at some level, need coaches, right? In all areas of our lives sometimes. And we tend to isolate and just try to do it ourselves. I think that's especially true in marriage. That can look a lot of different ways. Marriage encounter, broadly, probably the best known one is Weekend to Remember. That is a common one that's pretty broad. Dennis Rainey was the founder of that. It came out of Campus Crusader Crew. But there are other kinds of encounters. There are also, I think, a real need for small groups around marriage, where we create maybe mentor couples, and some churches or faith communities do that, who actually partner with couples that are at an earlier stage, or sometimes affinity groups, so people that are trying to recover from some major wound, even something like infidelity, where other people are finding they've worked through that and can bring some redemptive influence into that. So coaching, I think, is essential. I really do. I would agree with you. In a way, if you have people that are in your faith communities in some form of something like Stephen's ministers who can come alongside, or some churches, as I said, do marriage mentoring, that's a great way to do that. And then there are a number of people that are not as well known who do seminars on marriage that begin to kind of open up those discussions. But I do believe that seminars are really important, but they kind of have a half-life to them. You've been to those retreats and things that really impact you, but it diminishes by half over time. That's where you need the coaching to come in behind it. You were going to say? Thank you. Yes. Marriage is a developmental process. That's a completely different way to think about it, isn't it? And what are those stages? What do they look like? I showed you that Marriage 101 notebook. That's from a seminar that we do, but it defines those developmental stages, or at least my take on it. There are other people who do that too. Well, here you are at the end of your night. You're going to go home and connect with your spouse, right? Yeah. I would encourage you to at least think about connecting with your spouse and starting a different kind of conversation. Yeah. Thank you so much for being here, and appreciate Gordon-Conwell inviting me, and we'll end our evening there. Thank you.
Absolutely glad to be here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Powers. It was a pleasure to have you back. It's always good to have you back with us, and we appreciate very much your ministry with us. Let me remind you that we do have copies of Harv Powers' book, Redemptive Leadership, for sale out here, $15. So please pick up one of those on your way out if you would like to have one. Let's close our time together in prayer. Father, as we come before you, I want to thank you that you have made us for yourself and that you have made us for each other. And I thank you that you have granted us to share in an extraordinary web of relationships with one another, with your Son, with you, through your Spirit. And I thank you, Lord, that you have created us in such a way that our marriages and our families are central to the way that we guide your people, the way that we minister to your people, and bear witness to and minister to the world. We thank you for Harv Powers, for his ministry of strengthening marriage and strengthening leaders. We thank you for the ministry that you've given him among us this evening. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Thank you, everybody, for coming.